Welcome to Millennium Counseling Center's podcast, where each week we go in depth into all things mental health, addiction recovery, and being our healthiest and happiest self. Enjoy. Derek, good to see you today, man. We were talking a little bit the other day about the differences between boundaries and requests. This comes up a lot in my sessions, I'm sure yours as well. How do you differentiate between boundaries and requests?
Well, I guess in talking about this, you just gave me, kind of your definition of that. And I thought it was very good. So I'll throw it back to you. And
Okay. So for me, one of the things that I try to communicate with people is that there are differences between requests and boundaries, even though they may sound the same in your mind or when you're talking about them. So the big difference for me is a request is asking someone to do something. Can you pick up your laundry? Can you show up on time? Can you stop drinking? Whatever it is, you're asking someone to do something. In those cases, you're giving somebody all the power. They get to decide whether or not they're going to do that or not. And we have our own feelings of whether or not they do it or not. And so that's kind of on the request side. On the boundary side is stuff that we do for ourselves. So a boundary, we reclaim all of the power within a boundary. And so what we can say to somebody is, you can do what you need to do in your life or what you want to do. But if these things happen, this is what I need to do for me. And so the example that I tell people is, I'm going to a sporting event with somebody and they offer to drive. And, I say to them, hey, look, if you choose to drink, great, that's totally fine. But I'm not comfortable driving home with you if you drink. And that's my boundary. And a request would have been, hey, if you drink, just keep it to a minimum just for safety reasons. A boundary is, this is what I need to do for me if this happens. And that can get kind of blurry. You have one beer and it's the end of the game and it's an hour for an Uber or a bus. And the other person's like, hey, I just had one beer. Come on, I'm totally fine. And now you have to decide, what are you going to do with your boundary? Do you break your boundary? Do you keep your boundary? That's how to differentiate between a request and a boundary is letting somebody else make the decisions in their life versus you make the decisions for your life.
yeah, I agree with that. I think that people are generally uncomfortable. They're more comfortable with making a request than they are with setting a boundary. And I think part of that is that they may not feel like they have that right to ask that of somebody. But if you really break it down and look at what you're asking, it's usually reasonable. It's not it changes, I guess, in the situation. But the comfort level with making a request, if I, to use your example, if I say, hey, Oren, I'm hoping you don't have any drinks at the game, versus kind of letting you know what then is going to be the steps that I'm going to take, then sometimes people feel like that's confrontational. At the end of the day, though, it is less confrontational, right? It creates less of a problem because what you're doing is you're leaving open a place for expectations. Where if I ask you to do that, now I'm waiting to see if you're willing to do that or not. And then to your point, then I have to make a decision that ultimately could feel like conflict. I say, okay, I'm not going to ride home with you. I'm just going to get an Uber. So this goes to similar to something that I work on a lot with people is kind of the difference between expectations and agreements. And I think that a request sets up expectations. That if I ask you to do something, then my expectation may be, okay, well, I asked him to do it, so he's not going to drink. Your expectation may be, to your point, well, I just had one, so it should be fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And so I think that is ultimately going to create more conflict than the secondary piece, where what I would also term as an agreement that, I just tell you what my landscape of this is. And at the end of the day, you can make that decision to do whatever you want to do. I'm just letting you know that if that's the case, then this is the decision I'm going to make. And so there's no surprise there. There's no shock that when I jump in an Uber, because you had some drinks, that now you can't be like, I didn't know you were going to do that, or I wouldn't have had a drink. And so I think it's just kind of really being transparent and kind of fairly communicating with people. And my belief is that agreements are much less likely places to have conflict.
Yeah. Well, in this example, even though it may happen for some people, probably the more realistic ones are things that happen between a parent and a child, or between two people that are in a friendship or a relationship. And I think it's important to talk about setting aside what specific examples are of requests or boundaries, but that requests and boundaries like exist in relationships and what the differences are, and to talk to each other about, hey, like, I'm going to have some requests and these are the things that matter to me. And if you don't do them, or you do them, like, yeah, it's going to affect me, but ultimately you have to do your life. But I do have boundaries, whether it's, you know, rules in a home or agreements that we have in a relationship of things that are out of bounds. And really talking about what those boundaries are helps people feel safe in those environments.
Yeah. And, no, most of the time when we talk about boundaries, right, I'd say 95% of those conversations are around that individual setting their own boundaries. That's what they're trying to learn how to do, or what people are telling them to do. But I think another important aspect of this that we don't talk about as much, which I think is equally important, is on the receiving end, how you take in boundaries, how you accept boundaries, how you even hear boundaries. I think that many times people have a feeling that a boundary is, like an ultimatum, right? Like, if you do this or don't do this, then this is going to happen. And, generally speaking, people don't feel good about being given ultimatums. And at times will just completely push back against that and do the opposite because they don't think you should be able to do that. But I think it's really important that when someone is setting a boundary with us, that we look at that from a place of that, okay, this is a healthy thing they're doing, and this can be helpful to our relationship based on the things we just talked about less conflict. I think that if we can be mindful of that, again, which is difficult, but to understand that, most of us, what we want to know is we want to know where we stand with people. We want to know how they feel about us. We want to know what our relationship is like. And if you have, to your point, between parents and kids or partners, if both of you know where you stand with the other person and know what the choices are that you need to make, then it's a much easier way to navigate through that. If you know that I'm not going to ride with you if you have a drink, then you can make that decision. You can say, okay, I feel like having a drink. That means, Derek's not going to ride with me. Or you say, I really want to ride home together so we can chat some more. So I'm not going to have that drink. And so it just feels like just an easier way to communicate with each other, to not only set boundaries, but also to accept boundaries and to be okay with people doing that, because they're giving you information that ultimately we would all say we want.
Yeah. And I think you bring up an awesome point. Whereas if you're in a place where you want to make a request or set a boundary, if you're really angry, right, something happened and you're like, if you do this again, then that probably is a threat. You haven't really processed what is really going on with you and why that specific thing was so activating for you, to then really figure out what it is that you need to feel safe. And I've used that word a few times now, safety, because that's kind of what boundaries are. We create boundaries in our lives for safety, not to control somebody else, not to decide what is right or wrong in a certain situation, but for our own well-being. And so, again, I think you really pointed out something awesome, which is how you receive a boundary is really important, but then kind of flipping it back to the person saying it, what kind of headspace or emotional space are you in when you're sitting down with someone and communicating something at this level? Have you really thought it out? Have you talked to a therapist? Have you talked to a friend? Have you journaled about it? That if this is so significant for your safety that you want to tell someone about it, how much time are you really spending navigating what this really means for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with all of that. And what this does, if done properly, right, is just makes relationships easier to navigate. And regardless of the relationship, they take work. They're hard. You've got two different people. We're imperfect beings and we're dealing with all of those things. I just was thinking about when you were talking about that. I know we've used this example several times, but if I make a request, then the entire time I'm kind of on edge wondering if you're going to follow that request or not. And then there's judgment that comes in kind of naturally that if you follow the request, then I'm happy. But if you don't, then I'm going to be disappointed or angry. And ultimately, that can affect how you would navigate throughout the evening. I think that if you are able to really truly set a boundary, then it's pretty simple. It's like, look, I'm going to go to the game, I'm going to have fun, and then I'm either going to get a ride home or I'm going to get an Uber. And I don't need to make a judgment decision on that. I don't need to have any judgment in that. It's just because here's the agreement that we have. And so it's not in my hands to make a decision anymore because I've already established what that decision would look like. And then I think it makes it easier on me. And I think it makes it easier on you. And just, kind of relieve some of the potential tension that can be there. Yeah, because if I have an expectation and you don't follow through it, then I'm disappointed, right? And then now I'm disappointed over something else because I made a request and I didn't get what I was looking for. And I think the more we can set ourselves up to just kind of know the lay of the land and not put ourselves in positions to be disappointed and judgmental is going to make all those relationships much easier.
Yeah. And I think when we're making the requests, I don't think that we're actually thinking them as requests. I think we're thinking them as you're going to do this thing because you care about me or because I'm making this important. And so it kind of feels almost like we're doing it like a boundary, but it's a request. And so that, again, is one of the reasons why I felt like it was important to talk about this, because if we think we're setting a boundary, but it's really a request, then we're confusing ourselves and we're confusing the other person, which again can lead to that exact scenario that you talked about, which is I'm scanning and thinking about what they're going to do and are they going to respect me? And if they don't respect me, then this means that and all these other things. And so again, it really kind of, I like your kind of differentiation between setting that agreement and not leaning on expectations. And for a lot of people that I talk to, leaning into that is uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to say what you need. It's uncomfortable to ask somebody what their plan is because we're not really trained or taught how to do that.
Yeah. And typically, the more difficult the relationship is, like the more opportunity there is to disagree on things, then setting the boundary feels even harder, right? Like if it's a very easy relationship that you have with somebody, then that doesn't feel as hard. But the interesting thing about that is if there is a difficult relationship, then that boundary is that much more important, right? Because you need clarity. There's already things that you guys may disagree on or have different views on. And so it's really important that the communication is super clear and that those agreements are set versus expectations, because you already know that that relationship has the potential to be somewhat tumultuous. And so we want to make those easier. So as the relationship that you have with that person is more complicated and difficult, then that becomes that much more important to kind of really have these boundaries and these agreements and have things be really clear as far as what each of you can expect from each other.
Yeah. And as you were talking, I was thinking of probably a classic example for people that live together, partners, spouses, whatever. You said you'd be home at 6:00, right? And it's 6:30 and you didn't even text to tell me, right? Like, I need you to, be home by 6 or tell me that you're going to be late, right? Like, for me, that's not really, you're not really yet at a boundary or request. You're in a feeling state, right? I feel neglected. I feel less than. I feel sad that you said you were going to be home at a certain time and didn't come home and didn't let me know. I feel sad. Like, that's an emotional state to be shared so that you don't obviously kind of lead to resentment or other feelings around that. But again, sometimes boundaries and requests can come out of those conversations. Like, hey, like, in order for me to feel supported and valued in this relationship, here's what I need. This is what I need. And maybe that turns into a boundary or a request. But again, it's kind of like there's a lot of different elements to this, and it's important to know which space you're in. Are you in a request phase? Are you in a feeling state? Or have you kind of figured this out enough to where this is a boundary? And wherever you are in either of those states, to let somebody know that, like, this is what's going on. And I want you to value our relationship enough to listen about kind of, this is where I am and this is how I'm doing.
Yeah, this is, can be very confusing things, but, many times these little nuances of the way you do things and how you communicate with people and the type of relationship you have is really important and critical to us, kind of having the best possible relationships, not only with other people, but also feeling good with ourselves about the way we're living our lives. And to your point, protecting yourself, right? And not protecting yourself through distance or through closing yourself off, but protecting yourself through communication and effectively helping other people understand where you're coming from and what you need from them so that they're able to feel good about it as well.